Hi, welcome to week 14 of CNET52. So today I'm going to make a video, and then when we meet for lab on Wednesday, when we meet on Wednesday, we'll just do the lab starting at 8 a.m. Right, so we'll be done earlier in the morning so we can start um, the lecture right now. So um, as you can see over here, I have the PowerPoint open, which is right off of Canvas. So today we're going to talk about file and printer sharing, and then managing users and group accounts, and then securing shared resources. So last week in the lab, right, in lab 13, you created user accounts in the Windows machine, the Linux machine, and the Macintosh machine. And then this week we're going to take a look at how we can leverage that with our file sharing. So the main file sharing protocol between all of the operating systems is the SMB, the server messaging um, message block protocol. And it's the native file sharing protocol in Windows, but it's easily and readily supported in both Linux and Mac. And one of the oldest file systems for network sharing is NFS, or Network File System. And that's the native file sharing protocol for Linux. And Windows can support NFS with the right software installed. All right. And then printer sharing also uses the server message block, um, whereas in Windows for sure, and then in Linux, the way you can share is with the line printer remote or line printer um, daemon. Okay, so we're going to do all that. As you can probably guess, in lab, you're going to be sharing some files between your Windows machine to your CentOS machine to your Linux to your Macintosh machine, and then from your um, CentOS to Windows and to the Mac, and then from the Mac to CentOS and Windows. Okay, so for file sharing in Windows is based on client for Microsoft Networks, and then the file and print sharing for Microsoft Networks on the server side. And to view these, you can, to see these components, view the properties of your network connection. To share the files, you just share the folder that the data's in. So that's what we're going to do, is share it. Now there's a couple ways you can figure this. Or one is with the file sharing wizard. One is with the shared folder snap-in, which is in computer management, or in the advanced sharing dialog box. And the way we're going to do is we're just going to do a simple file share. So let me open a folder. So let's say I wanted to share this folder right here. If you just right click on it, and of course I'm on Windows 11 here. It's the same in Windows 10. Go to properties, and then if you click on sharing, you can share it here, or you can go into the advanced sharing and share it there. All right. And again, we'll do that in lab. Now with computer management, if you right click on start and then go computer management, and it's occurring on my other screen so you can't see it, but once that opens, you have it here, and then you can go to the shared folder, and you can create a new share here. Just right click, new share, and you can go through it that way. All right. So there's a lot of ways to do it. So here's the right click, shared, share this folder, and then you set up the permissions, and away you go. All right. So you'll do that in today's lab. So you'll have plenty of practice. Now, when a user or application requests a resource, a redirector intercepts the request and examines it to determine whether the resource is local or remote. If local, sends a request to local software. If it's remote, it sends a request over the network to the host machine that is hosting that share. So when we create a share in Windows, then go to our CentOS box, and say, hey, go load that up. If that request will go to our Windows share, and then it will locate it, and then away it goes. Okay. Now, typically for our shares, we're going to use what's known as the Universal Naming Convention, or UNC, which the syntax for that is // the server name and then the share name. And if the server name doesn't work, a faster way, and probably the best way to test it just to see does it work, is with the IP address. So that's what we're going to do in our lab. Is we'll set it up with the / IP of your Windows machine and then the name of the share name. All right. And then you can, of course, map the drive in File Explorer or with the net command. And remember, we talked about the net command last week when we looked at the system utilities for the network. All right. Now, some of the components for a shared printer, you need the print device, which is either local or network, and then the printer, a print server, and a print queue. And some of the benefits of using a shared printer is you get better access control. You can pool your printers. You can set a priority to the printer, and then you can manage the print jobs and manage the availability. And to configure a shared printer, after installing the printer, you just open the printers as scanners, and then right-click on the printer property. The printer, go to the properties, click the sharing tab, and it's almost the same setup as file sharing, right? So here's the sharing, where you just basically say, okay, I want to share this printer, which is right here. Give it a network name if you want to, and then render joint print jobs. And if you're sharing the printer on a network that has both 32-bit and 64-bit OSs, for Windows specifically, you want to make sure you add the additional drivers. So you may have to go download 32-bit drivers and point this additional drivers to it. That way, if somebody with a 32-bit OS tries to use your printer, they will get the right drivers, and away you go. All right. Now, Linux supports file sharing by using SMB protocol and a package called Samba. So with Samba, and instead of right-clicking on anything and going into property sharing, you have to edit the command line. And there are some GUI-based tools for configuring Samba, but the most common way is by doing it from the command line, and that's the way we're going to do it. So we're going to install Samba, and then we're going to edit this smb.conf file, which is in the etc Samba folder. And then when you use printer sharing in Linux, is straightforward. Once Samba has been installed, you just create a new printer, and it's going to be shared automatically. Now, to access shared files via a Linux client, you use the Files tool and browse the network, and then click on the computer icon, enter your credentials, then click on the share, and it'll go from there. Okay? Now, once you install Samba, Linux has a command line tool called SMB Client, where you can access those shares as well. So here's the SMB client where you run it, and then you're saying, hey, go look at Greg's Mac. It's a local folder 1, and then it will give you the information. All right. Now in Mac, Mac supports SMB, and to click a share with another user, if you want to share it on the Mac, you have to go into the system preferences and turn on file sharing under the sharing applet, and then away you go from there. All right. So here is how you share a folder. You turn on file, you go into system preferences, click on file sharing, then go to the shared folder and say who are you going to share it with, and away you go. Okay. All really simple. And then in Mac, to share a printer, you again go into the sharing dialog box, click on the box next to printer sharing, and then you go from there. All right. Now, when you go to connect to a Windows share in the Mac, instead of putting // you have to put SMB colon and then //. So there's and all the steps are in the lab, so you won't have any problem with that. So which of the following is native to Linux for file sharing? And that, of course, is the where's my mouse? Is the network file system, right? SMB, that's native to Windows. UNC is a universal naming convention. FTP is for file sharing on a website. All right. So NFS is the correct answer. All right. Then this next section, we've done this already, right? We did this last week in lab where we created user accounts, and we did that in Windows and in CentOS and in our Mac OS. So this is just kind of a review, but in a large network, it's groups are going to be important to manage your users, and user accounts should have a naming convention. So like if my name is kmiller30 and yours is, Francine.Miller, I mean, that's two different conventions and people get confused. So you should come up with a convention and then stick with it. So, and in some companies, they won't use any personally identifiable information. So they may use your first letter, your middle name letter, your last name letter, and then some company identifier. So it could be KJM Tech and Health .mountsac.edu or something like that. So they don't want to give away your first and last name, but some places do. Okay. Now, in Windows, your username doesn't matter if it's uppercase or lowercase. So you can log in with all uppercase, but your password will always be case sensitive. In Linux, it's totally different. So if you created last week's lab 14 with a capital L, and you go to connect to it with the share with a little lowercase l, it will not work properly. So you want to make sure that those are exactly the way they should be. All right. So if you're troubleshooting in lab on Wednesday, double check the name that you created and the name that you're trying to connect with. All right. Some of the things for password from a security standpoint is the length, the complexity, who's the owner or the creator, and then how often do you have to change your passwords. And then, of course, group membership and groups give us the flexibility to scale into a large environment. So if we have 5 users, we can just right-click share, user 1, user 2, user 3, 4, 5. But if we're in an area where we want to share something with, say, 5,000 users, it'd be easier just to share to the users group, and then everybody in the users group can access it. That way you don't have to go add 5,000 people to it. All right, and then you're there. Now, when Windows is first installed, the 2 users that are created are the administrator and the guest. And on Windows Server 2016 and above, the guest account is disabled. The admin account, the administrator account is used, right? And then in Windows 10, both the administrator and the guest account are disabled by default. And the administrator has full access to everything. So once you create a user and you make them an administrator, you've given them the full keys to the entire kingdom of your operating system. So you want to be careful with that. Now, in a domain, the Active Directory users and computers is where you will set up user accounts. And then you also can create organizational units. And then you normally put your users and your groups inside of the OU and kind of nest everything. And the organizational units typically are created to reflect the org chart or the department structure in your business. So like, for example, if you're in the finance office and you're in the accounts payable, you'd probably be in the finance OU and then in the accounts payable groupings underneath that. All right. Now, to create a new user, probably the best way to do it is in computer management. So go to computer management, local users and groups, and then right click the area that you want to put it, click new and user, and away you go. Right, and you did this last week. So we have lab 14 on our machines waiting for this week. All right, and then once you set up the user account, you want to make sure if you do use this user must change password at next logon, if the next time they access the machine is via a file share, they will not be able to change the password. So if they're only using remote connectivity, don't turn this on unless they have access to a local machine where they can actually log on and then change the password. Okay, and then if you say the user must change their password and the user cannot change the password, it's going to say, that, hey, you can't do both of those simultaneously. It's one or the other. All right, and away you go. All right, and then this last section here, we'll talk about groups. And on a local machine, you have domain local. On a directory or a domain system, you have global and then universal. And the group types can be the security group, which is where we use for shares, and then a distribution group, which is used for email addresses. So like when you get messages that are addressed to students at mountsec.edu, that's all students, that's a distribution group. All right. Now user and group accounts in Linux are used for the same purposes in Windows, right, for authentication and authorization. And in Linux, the root user is the same as the administrator account in Windows. And most Linux administration is going to be done from the command prompt. So like last week, you used user add, group add, user mod. Those commands are used to create user accounts there. All right. Now, when we create a share in Samba, we have to also use the SMB prefaces to the user account and the password account. So when you create a new user account, you want to do SMB user and then add that. And it has to match one of your user accounts on your Linux box. So we created lab 14 last week. We'll do an SMB user, SMB password for lab 14, and then it will work with our file shares. Right? And then the group add is how you add users to a group. And to add a user to a group, you use user add, username, and then the group name. And then group add creates groups, and then you add them in there. Now, if you look in the Etsy passwords file with the cat Etsy password command, it will show you your the users that are on there. So when you're doing lab on Wednesday and you try to connect and it says no such user, go back to when you're trying to get onto your Linux Samba share, go look at that Etsy password file and make sure it's uppercase or lowercase is set properly. Now, if you followed the directions in last week's lab, the directions in this week's lab will fit that perfectly. All right. Now, Linux also has a GUI tool to manage users and groups. And if you go and just click on activities and then search for users, it'll pull up this users group and you can manage it that way. All right, in Mac, you create user and group from the GUI. You could use the Linux commands, but it's probably more convenient to use the GUI. So you go into System Preferences, Users and Groups, and then you can create the users there. And here it shows, is it a standard user, is it an administrator, or how are you going to create it? And then away you go from there. All right. So now let's talk about securing resources. So once we have our shares created, we have our user accounts created, Now let's talk about how we can share it. And um, one thing you can also control is access in and out of your box with the firewall. So one of the things, if you have trouble with your file shares in lab, check the firewall. And just for testing purposes, disable the firewall, and then get everything working. And then later on, you could go and make exceptions in your firewall to allow those resources to be accessible. All right. Now, the general rule for securing anything on our networks is to allow the least access as required. So the principal least privilege. So you want to make sure that's there. Now, permissions should be only given to those accounts that need it rather than everyone, right? You could create a share and say everybody has full access, but then you're just really asking for trouble. So you want to be careful with that. So permissions specify which accounts. Network access is based on the protocol that's being used, right? So in Windows, it's the SMB protocol. And then an interactive session requires the user to be signed into the computer console. So there's that. Now, once we share a folder, there's two ways we can set the permissions. So let me go into a folder. I'll just create a new folder on my computer here. So I'm going to go into my C drive. And I'm just going to do a new folder here. We'll call it share. And then if I right click on this, properties, sharing. Now I can share it here. So if I'm going to share it with myself, I'll just click on share. And then it says, do you want to turn on network discovery? I'll turn that on. And that will go through and create that share. So now if I look at the properties again, with the sharing properties, it tells me this resource is shared and it's shared with the user can. Now I can also go into the security, and this shows me the NTFS permissions. So there's two types of permissions that we can set. The share properties, which are read write, and then the file and folder permissions, which are NTFS. Now, if the permissions are contradictory, so I say read write in one but only read in the other, the most restrictive will apply. So file and folder permissions always apply, and then in each file the permission can be set to either allow or deny. Now, share permissions with share, you can't configure them on files, only on folders. So the three permissions are read, change, and full control. And if you don't change anything, if you say just create a new user, share it with Lab 14, it's going to be a read. So you want to double check that and make it read write if that's what you want to do. So here's shared with everyone, and the default is read. Now, file and folder permissions can be configured on both folders and files. And the folders inside of the shared folder will inherit from the parent folder, just like the files will inherit from the parent folder. And folders have 6 basic permissions and 14 advanced permissions, where files have 5 basic permissions and 13 advanced permissions. So here are the shared folder properties, and you can see here that the folder has read and execute, list, write, modify, and full control. And you can drill down and get as restrictive as you want. Okay. Now for our file shares in our this week's lab, we're going to just do the share permissions. But we could go back in and drill into more details with the NTFS permissions. All right, and then in Linux, there are only 3 permissions, read, write, and execute. But the permissions are assigned to the owner, the group, or the other. So when you do a long list dash L or a ls dash L, that's a long list, it will show you the group, um, the owner, and the other permissions. So the creator, whoever creates the file or the folder, they're the owner, and the owner always will have full permissions. And then if you're in a group that has permissions, um, so we put lab 14 into our lab 14 group, and then we're going to share it to the group, and that will then lab 14 will have access to it, right? And there'll be a section in the lab where you'll go in and you'll change the permissions on a file with the change group or change owner, the chown or cha group, and that's how you can modify that. All right. In with Linux file, with Samba file sharing, there are only two permissions: read and write. So each user who should have access to a folder must be assigned a password specific to Samba. So that's where you're going to do that SMB password. So if you set up the user accounts last week, but you don't do the SMB password this week, you're not going to have access to your Samba shares. All right, so the process of using user accounts to assign permissions to network resources and defining the types of actions a user can perform is known as what? That's known as the authorization. So remember, the authentication is you are who you say you are. The authorization is based on your permissions. So this is talking about permissions. All right, so this chapter is fairly short, and hopefully if you watch this whole video, and we talked about creating file shares, creating users, and then securing the permissions with the username and the share information. All right. Hopefully that gets you where you need to be for this week. And again, remember to come to lab. We're going to start lab at 8 o'clock. So it's a flipped classroom. I want you to watch this video prior to coming to lab. And then on Wednesday at 8 o'clock, I'll open up the lab. I'll do a short demo of it and then let you loose on the lab, and then you'll be done. And we should be done by hopefully around 11, 10:30, 11. All right. I'll see you on Wednesday. Bye.